Hey, everybody. Welcome to this episode of B2B Revealed. B2B Revealed brings you the best of B2B. Whether you're a B2B seller, a B2B marketer, or simply a B2B leader, this show will provide you the tools and insights you need to be successful. My name's Sean Campbell. I'm the CEO of Cascade Insights, and I'm your host. I love to hear from listeners. If you have any questions about the show, or you would like to suggest a topic I should cover in the future, just email me at sean@cascadeinsights.com. On this episode, I'll be interviewing Adele Sweetwood. Adele is the author of The Analytical Marketer, How to Transform Your Marketing Organization. It's a book I highly recommend, and I'll be discussing the book in some detail with her on the show. Adele is also the VP of Global Marketing and Shared Services for SAS, a well-known software and analytics company. Adele had a lot of interesting things to say about how analytical and creative marketing skills can work together in harmony to drive great outcomes. And I'm sure you're going to love hearing what she has to say. Finally, if you love this show, don't forget to post a review of the show on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you happen to listen. And now, on to the show. Adele, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Would you mind giving the folks that are listening a little more on your background? I'm sure they'd love to hear a little bit more.
Absolutely. I am currently a Senior Vice President of Global Marketing at a software company, and that entails a lot of the forward-facing, customer-facing marketing efforts for global organization across the geographies, so Americas, EMEA, and Asia Pacific. I have a great understanding and appreciation for the differences in marketing cultures across the globe. So that's a lot of fun. My background is mostly in the technology industry and a lot of sales and marketing roles. And I had this really great time writing a book.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about the book. I thought it was a fantastic read.
Thank you. It is called The Analytical Marketer. It is a story of how we transformed our own marketing organization. It was written as it was being done, so to speak, and it was born out of really not finding as much information that we wanted to find about the business side of changing marketing. There's a lot of information about the technology, about the techniques. There's all kinds of reports and information about what we should be doing in marketing and channels and metrics. And we're an analytical organization, so we had a lot of the baseline. But when we started asking questions about how do we organize, how do we think about the customer differently, how do we change the culture across the organization, what type of talent do we need, and what does that impact the relationships we have across the company and the leadership and how we help people lead more effectively in an analytical culture, that we couldn't find. And so we were doing what we were doing and learning a lot along the way, and it was suggested that we start to share that. I worked closely with Harvard Business Review and an outline, and then started the writing process. But I'll be honest, it feels like we're still transforming, just like everybody else. And when I go back and look at parts of the book, it feels like, well, we're doing that still, or we're doing that different. So it's kind of cool to watch it come together and to keep talking about it.
Awesome. Yeah. And like I said, I highly recommend the book. So let's take a tour through it a little bit. There's a few different areas I think that are worth digging into. We'll obviously not be able to cover everything in the book, but just want to hit some really important areas, I think. And the first one, I'm actually going to start off with a quote. In the book, he said, "The days of marketing as simply an artistic endeavor are gone forever. That's not to say that creative skills are not in demand. It's just that they are alone insufficient." I know that sets the stage for a few other things that I'll be asking you about, but just tell me about that quote, because I think that's a challenging thing for marketers today who maybe grew up in an era where the creative skills were a little more predominant, and now maybe the analytical skills are at least on par or maybe even taking over for a modern marketer.
Yeah, I think that was definitely, or has been definitely, the hot topic around the art and science of marketing. And is one going to take the other one over? And even in the quote and in the book, that's certainly not what I see. I think we're moving more from pure art to art and science. And the days of, I think we talked about the days of Mad Men being gone in terms of pure advertising. And that's true for the field of marketing in general. Just by the sheer number of channels and opportunities we have to engage with customers and prospects. And that in and of itself changed the landscape for all of us over the last 10 years significantly. So that means we have to pay a lot more attention to what's happening around us. And the science part plays into that. And I've been in the analytics business in an analytics company for 40 years, but analytics has only become the business topic in maybe the last 10. That people are truly starting to understand the value of data and information and how you translate that into valuable insight that you can make decisions from. That's been a progressive aspect of the business part of it for the last 10 years for sure, and more so in more business-oriented areas like marketing. So the real challenge is combining both, because the reality is, whether you're talking about a marketing activity or a growth strategy and investment, you're going to combine instinct and gut and knowledge and experience with data and analytics. The information that data is telling us tells us a story. You apply that to your instinct or to your artistic creativity or to your emotion or whatever other components to get to hopefully a better decision, a more intelligent decision or strategy. And I think for us, it's been really helping those that probably lean more towards the creative to learn how to use the data and analytics to their advantage, to be part of their skill set. And I try not to distinguish too much for them, because again, it's just as important. And today we can measure everything. So they have to bring that into the skill set. It's what's modernizing marketers overall. I feel like that change and adoption is happening. I think it's harder. It's a harder conversation today, in my opinion, at the leadership levels. And I'm hearing conversations like, well, you're either a brand CMO or you're a demand gen CRO, you're data driven or you're this, and like, no, all that's gone. It's all blended. You have to follow the customer from beginning to end. And anything you do at the brand level today can be measured, and it has a huge impact on what you might be doing for demand generation or for customer support or retention efforts. It's all connected. We can't separate them into silos anymore.
That's a really good summary. So a related question I have is, when a modern marketer comes to you with an idea, because in marketing teams, it happens all the time, right? I'd like to do this thing, this campaign, invest in this, do that. How do you want them to back it up? Because there was obviously a day or a period of time that, like you alluded to, where it was mostly vetted on how creative or interesting or even maybe fun it sounded. And then the thought was people would pay attention to it because of that. But you allude to this in the book a few different places, that you better have a different way of approaching your pitch if you're going to come to me with an idea these days.
Yeah. If it's expanding on an existing program, you better come to me with the data, with the analysis, with the results. What did you learn? What did you change? Why? When? What are we seeing in the outcomes? If it's a brand new idea and you might not have the data yet, then you better come to me with a test plan, because today we can test everything. Again, we can move very quickly. We can pilot things. We can test out different creatives. We can test out different channels and have it very comprehensive. You can move faster. You need to be more agile. And so if you have this test plan, then you're going to know very quickly, was this investment worth it or not? Or how do I change it? And what did I learn from it? I don't care if it fails. I just want to know that you're going to know that it failed and you're going to change it.
Yeah, good point. Especially the point about knowing that it failed, which historically might have been more of a challenge for some folks sometimes in marketing roles. And it's still, to a degree, a challenge today.
Yeah, you put things out there and you could be months before you knew much about what was happening. That doesn't happen anymore. We can find out very quickly in the channels today whether something's working.
So let's continue to talk a little bit about how marketers need to change. You dig in the book into kind of the different skills that an analytical marketer needs to have. You talk through like sales skills and social media skills and journalism and storytelling skills and domain expertise and data skills. Obviously, folks who just even heard the book title probably are like, well, how can I become an analytical marketer? So what do you think are those skills that they need to build in totality?
It certainly starts with a lot of desire for curiosity, that you acknowledge that today we've got so much more data and information, so many more channels. I've got to be smarter about how I invest, how I take this message to market. Do I know my audience as well? Am I creating the right customer experience? So you have to have this desire to be more curious and more customer oriented and not solely goal oriented or message oriented. It's not necessarily all about what you want to take to the market, but what does the market want to hear? So I think it's a different kind of thinking when you talk about design. And that's why I talk about process design skills or storytelling styles or data and analytics, because those are the components that are going to help you find the story and ask the questions you need to ask. You don't have to be a coder or a statistician or a PhD, whatever, to be analytical in your thinking. And today there are tools and technology available to you. You have to get comfortable with that technology, and you can't expect someone else to do it for you. So a big shift in my expectations was that everyone that's in the marketing organization has that data and information at their fingertips, that they're manipulating the information, they're asking the questions. They may not be doing the analytical models, but they know what questions to ask. And the other piece of that then becomes a collaboration. And so if you have traditional database marketing people that are used to potentially just pulling a list and handing it to a marketer based on a set of demographics, I can't afford those anymore. I need segmentation analysts and data visualization analysts that are digging deep into the data and the results from all the campaigns, and then coming to the marketer with proposals on better targeting, better segmentation, regardless of the size of the list or the mechanics of it, being more intelligent in what they deliver as well. And then it becomes a very collaborative exercise of how you then design campaigns. So collaboration at a higher level, I think from marketing organizations I've worked with, we've done a kind of not great job sometimes of creating very siloed organizations. You might have been doing great in one channel, but another channel was suffering because of it. And you just created a bunch of silos competing with each other. And instead, you need the people that can bring those silos together, look across that, and design a strategy together. It's much more of a joint environment to go there. So we talk about orchestrator roles and someone that's sort of maybe leading a team of people that have a specialty like a segmentation analyst or a digital marketing person, a search person, maybe a content marketer. Everybody has a role to play, but they have to come together to actually be successful and reach a set of objectives that they share. I do think that changes kind of what we were looking for in marketing. And then, of course, I do expect people to be very savvy in social media, be very comfortable in the digital space. That's just part of marketing today. But that also includes technology, and it's not something that they can shy away from at all. But that's well received. It's great to watch people consume that and say, yeah, this is how I can become not just an analytical marketer, but more modern in my skill set to take it anywhere I might need to go.
Excellent. Well, and let me talk a little bit about that collaboration piece for a minute, because you mentioned that, teams in the past might have been a little siloed. And even from my own personal experience, when we've worked with larger technology accounts and we might be working with some marketing team or whatever, I remember circa X number of years ago, the product team or the marketing team would be broken down into, here's your product, here's your campaign budget, go to town. And you'd walk into the next office down the same hallway and it would be a different product, different campaign budget, different objectives. How hard has that been on some of the folks who maybe grew up in that era where they were kind of used to I guess I call it running their own ship a little more and being siloed, to now being part of these very multifaceted teams that are very kind of data driven, and you have to kind of justify decisions perhaps a little more concretely than you would have had in the past?
No, I think it becomes easier once you sort of force them into it, because you start to see the results and the information changes your mind over time. So I think when you started a lot of this, marketers came in, like you said, well, wait a minute, I've got to sell this product to this group of people. You can't reduce my list size. You can't tell me I shouldn't use that channel. I want to use all the channels and send this to everybody all the time. Everybody wants to do that. But the problem then becomes we're killing our customers with messages. None of them are performing to any kind of level that's valuable. So when you start sharing the results of what happens when you do that, or the stories that we have, we use a lot of forensic kind of exercises to show people some of the bad behaviors, if you will, to then say, okay, here's how we would design it differently. And then they start to see the positive results to say, yeah, you might have a different group of people you're going after, or it's the same group of people and there's a better propensity with this particular group because of the actions and behaviors they've already shown us. That's an intelligent way to approach them with the right response. You're going to get better response, fewer opt-outs, better conversions, higher demand generation. So it takes time for them to see that, but it literally is going to tell you in the data. And once people start to understand that, then they're asking more questions and becoming more curious and wanting to go deeper into not just maybe the segmentation of lists, but the performance of channels. And we'll make decisions about pulling a particular campaign completely out of a channel because it's simply not performing for that audience in that channel, or whatever the case might be. Or we do cross promotion in certain ways because we've seen a lift in that sense. What I've seen happen is when you create the environment that's highly collaborative and dependent on one another, that they learn how to leverage each other's expertise for the common goal. So your first thing from a leadership perspective you have to ensure is that you give them a common objective. Don't give them competing objectives.
Cool. So let's talk a little bit about those roles you mentioned a minute ago. You talked about orchestrators and segmentation analysts and data scientists. And some of those, when folks read the book, they'll be a little more familiar with, some not. But the orchestrator one is one of the ones that really stood out to me, because that's obviously somebody that gets all these folks to work in concert. What kind of background and skill set do you look for someone in that orchestrator role?
Sure. It's definitely a more senior role, someone that is very good at facilitating and project managing, if you will, to that type of skill set that can keep all the different elements in sync with each other and aligned and focused towards that common goal. But they have a lot of social marketing background, a lot of digital components to what they know and do, but also they're very versed in working, especially in the demand gen environment, because most of our orchestrators are part of a heavy demand gen strategy as well, would be working closely with sales organization, understanding that process very well, and also working closely with the product domain expertise and making sure that those components of positioning and messaging are clearly defined as part of that process. Because once you start the engine moving, you don't want pieces missing. So you're definitely someone that's willing to make sure that people are meeting their deadlines and processing through, but also can look at it across the bigger picture and be willing to make changes across that picture based on what you're seeing and how it performs. So I think people that know the event marketing world well, know the social marketing world well, demand generation have been the most common in that more senior role. But I think that's just a timing thing, right? I think that's going to be something. What I hope to see is that role being as a point of rotation for our organization, because it's a great learning role as well, as you have exposure to all these different channels and specializations that you might not have if you only do sort of one or two of the other categories.
Yeah, it makes sense. So let's talk a little bit about what an analytical content marketer might look like, as opposed to somebody who's maybe just good at putting up another blog post that says top 10 reasons you should do XYZ, which I think we're all tired of at this point, even though they're still unfortunately effective, which is why we'll probably still keep seeing some of them at least. But what does an analytical content marketer look like?
Yeah, so the content part, wow, like every organization, we went from one extreme to the other, from not having enough content to now just, we call it random acts of content, and just sort of overwhelmed with people saying, here, promote my content for the sake of content. And so we had to step back from it all and look at it from a governance and curation perspective and a performance perspective, not just from the creation side. So the structure is definitely based off a strategy and your go-to-market efforts and what messages you need based on what demographics and audience and targeting and personalization, and where are the missing gaps. We were guilty, like most companies, of just posting content or creating content because we could, versus where do we have a need for certain types of content, and how do we know what performs in that category or that topic or that channel best. And that's where I think content marketers come in, really from an analytical perspective, for looking at channel ready type metrics, channel performance type metrics. Where does the various results come from? Content syndication versus communities versus elements of content that are used through campaigns or go-to-market programs. And how do I make sure that as a content marketer, I'm elevating the visual and the message in a common piece of content appropriately by taking maybe a long piece of content and creating video components or briefs or slide shares and sort of distributing it in the right channels across. So I think clearly content marketers have a strong base knowledge of what the value of a content, the creation process, and what works well, but they need data and the analysis of that data to tell them that information in terms of what's working well and why, because that's the only way you're going to be able to manage and curate properly versus just sort of throwing everything out there at once to make it better. I think there's a lot of room. That's one area I'd say we still have a lot of opportunity to look at performance metrics and analytics in that space.
Cool. So let's switch a little bit to a conversation about sales and marketing. A couple of things I found interesting in the way you talked about it. One, there was a quote where you said the sales relationship needs constant care and feeding, which is a very different message than war and we'll always be at war, and that's the end of it kind of thing. And you also told this really great story about that sales came to you and said, basically, there's these perceptions of customer questions and keywords that they think customers are typing in to Google or the equivalent, and that your company should show up aligned with those terms. But then you turned around and said the analytics showed that nobody did, which I thought was interesting because it also implied that what sales thought was a good customer question or observation wasn't, in a data sense, actually a real one. And that was a really nice blending, I think, of marketing and sales. So if you want to expound on that story a bit, or just talk about how you manage sales and marketing relationships as an analytical marketer.
I've actually never prescribed, and I've been in roles with direct sales alignment in partnership for a long time. And I think it's because I look at it as alignment and partnership, and it shouldn't be a war. It shouldn't be an exercise in finger pointing or blaming. If you're not in this together, then you're just screwing the company, not anything else, right? So you have to think about it differently, and that's an important part of the relationship. But I'm also very conscious, and maybe it's because I came from sales at some point, that sales organizations are numbers driven. They're data driven by default. So I spent a lot of time educating and informing them about the types of data and analysis and results that we were seeing across marketing. And regardless of what the gut intuition might be from the guy or the girl that's been selling for the last 20 years, when you can see the data in front of you, then you have a different conversation. And there's always a meet in the middle point. The example that you talked about, or even others, and I know one that's probably near and dear to a lot of marketers, is sales organizations love to do events. They love to go to lots of events and trade shows because that person-to-person contact is invaluable. It absolutely is invaluable, but reality tells you you're not going to be at every event, and you have to be selective, and the ones that you are choosing to go to have to produce a certain type of value, and how do you know that? And so we went through lots of exercises of analyzing, both from a volume perspective and a outcome perspective, the investment in events. And you ultimately have to go back to the data to say, where am I getting the highest return and why? And then you can change your strategy associated with that. And again, even the most diehard salespeople would look at the data and tell you, okay, we shouldn't do those 20 things because they're not delivering value. And I think the other part of it became a conversation of joint accountability to the data. Marketing is highly dependent on the accuracy and the quality of the data put into most systems from a sales perspective, because that's how I'm measuring impact. And if you want to see additional investment, then the data needs to be of high quality and it needs to be in the system. Otherwise, we're not going to put in additional investment. So it's an education, it's a conversation, it's got to be a partnership. And the more I could talk numbers, outcomes, results, the better the conversation was going to be.
Makes complete sense. So let's talk a little bit about the times when it's a little maybe harder to get the data. So the times when maybe you have customers that you don't have that you want to win back, or you want to investigate in some analytical way a market segment you've yet to reach, or segments aligned with a new product initiative. Because I think rightly so, given the focus of the book, you're talking a lot about customer data and internal data and things like that. But obviously as marketers, sometimes you have to launch something that is into an area for which you don't really have internal data. So how do you go about the process then?
Well, there's certainly always sources of external data that you can purchase or tap into. But I think that's where a test and learn strategy comes into play. If you make the assumption that in the process of go-to-market, there's been an extensive, research done on the market and the potential customers and the product category and the competition and, all of the pieces and parts, you have enough information to know where to start. And typically, for example, when you're starting to do work with media companies or placements, they're going to give you data about their audiences that should help you determine whether or not that's in place. So you get data from the vendors as well as you're working with them. But then it's a matter of constant test and learn and change, right? So putting things out into a space aggressively, but being willing to very quickly shift over that investment if it doesn't work. And so that means that constantly somebody's monitoring, managing, changing, testing in that campaign. And I think that's more intense when you don't have the history data or the background information, or it's brand new to you as a company. You have to start with an aggressive testing strategy so you can learn from it and quickly adjust and not waste investments. And again, we're fortunate in marketing today that most digital and social channels allow us to do that very quickly. It wasn't the case 15 years ago, whatnot, that you really had that many options. And there's also a lot of organic activities that can be done to test more about the market and the message or the audience as well. So there's certainly outlets for that. I think people underestimate, though, that even if it's not your customer, you have a lot of prospects interacting with you on your website or on off-property sites where you've put content, and working again with those off-property sites for that data, but also really understanding your own data on your website, even if they're not yet a customer, will lead you to be able to understand and personalize offers and messages to those individuals more effectively.
So let's talk a little bit about how we'd scale this down for a mid-market or a small company. Because while the general principles still apply, some of the things you're talking about, because it's the area of expertise you're coming from, right, is going to be more of an enterprise company. But I'm sure some of the listeners who maybe work in a mid-market or a small business are like, that's great conceptually, but which parts of that should I start on first if I've got a more limited budget or a smaller team?
Yeah, and I get that question a lot because you're absolutely right. And I come from a larger organization and work with large organizations. But again, I think the problems are similar. I don't think the problems are that different scale. The good news for the smaller companies is the social and organic space is a great place to start if you have a limited budget. You can still do a lot of testing in those categories, and there are simple tools available to anyone, from a Google Analytics type thing to specific technologies and tools that are made just for SMB companies. So it could mean an investment, but I would probably argue that investment in technology and a way to capture data and analytics in your company is better than an investment in an ad you might buy or an event you might go to. From that standpoint, I would prioritize that over some of the other components first as you start to learn your audience and your space. But there's a lot more available than ever before, and as well as with training. There's a lot of training available to people to learn more about what's happening from a technique and strategy perspective. There's just so much more available to all of us, regardless of size. So pick a category, pick a project, pick a problem you're trying to solve, and start with that to sell that within the organization. And that's true whether you're small or big. But then I do think it's invest in some analytics-based technology, make sure you're capturing the data properly and putting some data stewardship around it as an organization.
That's some really good tips. So as a closing question, what's a book besides your own that you think folks should be reading and why?
So in the marketing realm, I am a huge Seth Godin fan. I think he's continued to be very inspirational, and I love reading his books. He's got a lot of them available out there now. I also just got my copy of Tom Davenport's Competing on Analytics, The New Science of Winning. It's a 10-year sort of revival of the book or refresh of the book. It's a good analytics read if you want to get more analytical in that context. It's not overkill for those of us that aren't statisticians. That's another one I'd recommend.
Well, hey, I just want to thank you for being on the show, Adele, and I'm sure the listeners loved hearing what you had to say.
Pleasure to talk to you, Sean.
And that concludes my interview with Adele. I truly enjoyed chatting with Adele, as she had a lot of great things to share about what it takes to become an analytical marketer. Her book, of course, goes into much more detail on all the subjects we covered during the interview, so make sure to grab yourself a copy of The Analytical Marketer. And as a closing note, if you're looking for more B2B insights, don't forget to visit cascadeinsights.com, where we have a plethora of articles, studies, and show notes, all of which will help you become smarter about the world of B2B. Thanks for listening.